A millionaire left his wallet next to a beggar who ran away immediately. But 2 hours later he broke down in tears at what he witnessed. The autumn rain fell steadily over London's financial district, casting a grey veil over the steel and glass towers that pierced the clouds. Inside one of these modern monuments to success, Alexander Blackwood stood at his office window, watching the city below through rivulets of water that transformed the view into an impressionist painting. His reflection in the glass showed a man in his early 40s, impeccably dressed in a bespoke suit, but with eyes that carried a weight no tailored fabric could disguise. On his desk, a newspaper lay open to a section about local community issues, featuring a story about the rising homeless population in London. Alexander's fingers traced the edge of his leather wallet, a nervous habit he'd developed over the past few months. The wallet itself was nothing special, just expensive leather filled with credit cards and a substantial amount of cash, but it had become something of an obsession lately. "Mr. Blackwood?" His assistant's voice interrupted his thoughts. "The board meeting starts in 5 minutes. Thank you, Sarah. I'll be right there." His voice carried the polished accent of Cambridge education, but there was a softness to it that betrayed his working-class origins. As he gathered his papers, his eyes fell on the family photograph hidden behind his computer screen. 2 young boys smiled at the camera, himself and Timothy, his younger brother. The image was 25 years old, taken before life had pulled them in drastically different directions. Before Timothy had ended up on the streets, before the tragic news 6 months ago that had changed everything. In the boardroom, Alexander delivered his quarterly presentation with his usual precision and authority. Blackwood Investments had grown exponentially under his leadership, and the numbers reflected that success. Yet even as he discussed profit margins and market expansion, his mind wandered to the experiment he'd been conducting for the past few weeks. After the meeting, he declined invitations to lunch with the board members, choosing instead to walk the streets of London. His expensive shoes carried him through puddles as he approached the areas he'd been studying, the places where the city's homeless sought shelter from the relentless weather. He'd developed a routine, carefully orchestrated to appear natural. He would stop at a coffee shop, fumble with his wallet while juggling his drink, and then accidentally drop it near someone who looked in need. Then he would walk away, only to circle back discreetly to observe what happened. So far, his wallet had been returned to him 16 times. Some had chased after him immediately, others had turned it in to nearby shops or police stations. Each time he'd rewarded their honesty generously, but each return had also left him with a complex mixture of emotions: relief at finding good people, guilt at testing them, and a gnawing emptiness that no amount of charitable giving seemed to fill. Today would be different, though he didn't know it yet. As he approached his usual coffee shop on Whitechapel Road, he noticed a new face among the regular street dwellers. The man sat huddled under a worn blanket, his beard obscuring most of his features, but there was something about his posture, an air of defeated dignity, that caught Alexander's attention. As he performed his now familiar routine, dropping his wallet near the man's makeshift shelter, Alexander felt a strange surge of anticipation. Perhaps it was the way the man's eyes had flickered with recognition at the sound of the wallet hitting the pavement, or maybe it was the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for it. This time, however, the script changed. Instead of calling out or reaching for Alexander, the man clutched the wallet and, with surprising agility, disappeared into the maze of side streets. Alexander stood frozen for a moment, his coffee growing cold in his hand, before his feet began moving of their own accord, following the mysterious figure into the gathering darkness of the London afternoon. Little did he know that this chase would lead him not just through the physical labyrinth of London's streets, but through the winding passages of his own past, toward a truth that would shatter everything he thought he knew about success, failure, and the true meaning of wealth. The late afternoon rain had subsided to a mere drizzle as Alexander navigated the narrow alleyways of East London. His Italian leather shoes, not designed for such pursuit, squeaked against the wet cobblestones as he maintained a discreet distance from the mysterious figure ahead. The man moved with surprising purpose, seeming to know exactly where he was going despite his apparent desperate state. Alexander's heart pounded, not from the physical exertion, but from the unfamiliarity of the situation. This wasn't his London, the pristine, polished city of financial districts and exclusive clubs. This was a maze of forgotten courtyards and centuries-old passages where the city's struggling souls sought refuge from society's judging eyes. The man ahead turned sharply into Brick Lane, weaving through crowds of tourists and locals browsing the vintage shops and curry houses. Alexander nearly lost him twice, only to spot the tattered blanket disappearing around another corner. Despite his initial impulse to call out or alert authorities, something held him back. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps it was the way the man clutched the wallet, not like a thief grasping stolen goods, but like someone holding a lifeline. As they ventured deeper into the heart of the East End, the surroundings grew increasingly unfamiliar. Victorian-era buildings loomed overhead, their weathered facades telling stories of London's complex history. The man's pace quickened as they approached Whitechapel Hospital, its modern extension contrasting sharply with the historical architecture around it. Alexander's breath caught in his throat as the man rushed through the hospital's automatic doors. This was unexpected. He hesitated for a moment before following inside, maintaining his distance as the man approached the reception desk. From his position behind a column, Alexander could hear fragments of an urgent conversation. "Please, my daughter." "The medication?" The man's voice was hoarse but educated, lacking the rough edge one might expect from someone living on the streets. He pulled out Alexander's wallet, hands trembling as he counted out the notes. The receptionist's voice was gentle but firm. "Mr. Harrison, we've been trying to reach you. Emma's condition has stabilized, but the new treatment protocol." Harrison. The name struck Alexander like a physical blow. Memories from his university days flooded back. Lectures at Cambridge, late-night study sessions, debates over coffee. Could it be? He moved closer, trying to get a better look at the man's face beneath the unkempt beard and years of hardship. The man was now heading toward the elevator, wallet significantly lighter, but steps more purposeful. Alexander followed, keeping his distance as they ascended to the pediatric ward. Through the ward's glass doors, Alexander watched as the man approached a bed where a young girl lay connected to various monitors. She couldn't have been more than 12, her pale face brightening as she saw her father approach. The man's transformation was immediate and heartbreaking. His shoulders straightened. A smile broke through his weathered features, and for a moment, Alexander caught a glimpse of the person he used to know. The girl, Emma, reached for her father's hand as he sat beside her bed. Even from a distance, Alexander could see the fierce love between them. A bond that had survived whatever circumstances had brought them to this point. A nurse approached with medication, accepting the payment the man had just arranged. Standing there in the sterile hospital corridor, Alexander felt the carefully constructed walls of his worldview beginning to crack. The simple narrative he'd created about honesty and morality suddenly seemed embarrassingly naive. Here was a man who had chosen to take what wasn't his, yes, but not for himself, not for greed or personal gain. As he watched the tender scene before him, Alexander's hand moved to his phone, then stopped. He had connections at this hospital, could make a few calls and learn everything about their situation within minutes. But something told him that approach, the businessman's approach, wasn't right for this situation. The girl was falling asleep now, the new medication apparently taking effect. Her father, who Alexander was increasingly certain was James Harrison from his university days, sat vigilantly by her side, gently stroking her hand. The scene stirred memories of Timothy, of nights spent wondering if he could have done more, been there more, understood more. Alexander stepped back from the door, his reflection in the glass showing a man caught between two worlds. The wallet, which had started as a test of others' honesty, had instead become a mirror, reflecting back questions about his own understanding of right and wrong, success and failure, wealth and poverty. As he made his way back to the hospital entrance, Alexander's mind raced with possibilities. He couldn't simply walk away, not this time. But neither could he swoop in like some fairy tale benefactor. If this was indeed James Harrison, the situation required delicacy, understanding, and perhaps most importantly, respect for the dignity of a man who had sacrificed everything for his daughter. The sun was setting as Alexander emerged from the hospital, casting long shadows across the courtyard. He had decisions to make, but first, he needed to confirm his suspicions. If James Harrison had fallen this far, what was the story? And more importantly, what had happened to the brilliant young man who had once dreamed of changing the world through medical research. Back in his Mayfair penthouse that evening, Alexander sat in his home office, surrounded by the trappings of success that now felt strangely hollow. His laptop glowed with old university photographs he'd spent hours searching for, frozen moments from 20 years ago at Cambridge. There, in a group photo from the biochemistry department's graduation ceremony, stood James Harrison, bright-eyed and confident, his arm around Alexander's shoulders. "Sarah," he spoke into his phone, "cancel my meetings for tomorrow morning. And could you find any information about a James Harrison? He would have been at Cambridge biochemistry, graduated same year as me. Focus on his career in the past 15 years. While waiting for his assistant's research, Alexander's mind wandered back to their university days. James had been brilliant, not just academically, but in that rare way that inspired others. He'd had big dreams of developing affordable medications for rare diseases, often staying up late in the lab while others headed to parties. Alexander had chosen the financial path, but James had been driven by something purer. The next morning, Sarah's findings filled in some of the gaps. James Harrison had indeed gone on to a promising career in pharmaceutical research. He'd published several papers in prestigious journals and had been on track for a leadership position at a major drug company. Then, about 7 years ago, everything stopped. No more publications, no career updates, no digital footprint. Alexander's car wound through London's morning traffic towards St. Bartholomew's Hospital. He'd made some discreet inquiries and discovered that Emma Harrison was being treated there, not Whitechapel. She'd been transferred for specialized care. As he navigated the hospital's corridors, his expensive suit felt like a costume, drawing curious glances from staff and visitors alike. Outside Emma's room, he paused. Through the window, he could see her reading a worn paperback book, her face showing the kind of strength no child should need to possess. James wasn't there, probably out searching for more ways to fund her treatment. Alexander had learned that Emma's condition was rare, requiring expensive experimental treatments not covered by the NHS. A nurse approached, checking his visitor's badge. "Are you family?" "An old friend," Alexander replied, his voice softer than usual. "Could you tell me about her condition?" The nurse hesitated, then seemed to make a decision based on something she saw in his expression. "Emma has a rare genetic disorder. The standard treatment stopped working about 6 months ago. There's a new drug trial that's showing promise, but..." She trailed off, the unspoken words clear. It was expensive, possibly prohibitively so. Alexander thanked her and walked to the hospital's coffee shop, his mind racing. He found a quiet corner table and pulled out his phone, scrolling through old emails. There it was, a message from James from 7 years ago that he'd never opened, lost in the daily deluge of business communications. With slightly trembling fingers, he opened it now. "Alex, I hope this finds you well. I know we've lost touch, but I could use your financial expertise. Gemma, my daughter, has been diagnosed with a rare genetic condition. I'm looking at leaving my position to focus on her care and research into her condition. There might be some investment opportunities in the treatment development. Would love to get your thoughts. Best, James." Alexander lowered the phone, his coffee growing cold before him. He'd missed this. Wrapped up in his own success, his own family struggles with Timothy. He'd missed a chance to help an old friend. The weight of that realization sat heavy in his chest. A commotion near the entrance caught his attention. James had returned, looking exhausted, but somehow more familiar in the daylight. He carried a small paper bag from a pharmacy and moved with the careful determination of a man conserving his energy for a long battle ahead. Alexander stood, then sat back down. The moment wasn't right. Confronting James here now might do more harm than good. Instead, he watched as his old friend disappeared down the corridor, noting how he stopped to exchange warm greetings with every member of the hospital staff he passed. Even in his current state, James maintained the genuine warmth that had made him so well liked at university. Pulling out his phone again, Alexander made a call to his company's research department. "I need everything you can find on recent drug trials for rare genetic disorders, particularly anything promising that's still in the development phase, and get me in touch with our pharmaceutical investment team." As he left the hospital, Alexander's mind was already forming a plan. It wouldn't be enough to simply offer financial help. That might solve the immediate problem, but wouldn't address the deeper issues. James had always been passionate about medical research. Maybe there was a way to help him return to that work, to find a path that would allow him to both care for Emma and pursue his original dreams. The autumn sun had broken through London's clouds, casting warm light across the hospital gardens. Alexander paused, watching patients and visitors enjoy the brief respite of good weather. Somewhere in his expensive briefcase, his spare wallet sat untouched, no longer needed for testing strangers' honesty. The real test, he realized, would be finding a way to help an old friend without destroying the dignity he'd sacrificed everything to maintain. The next few days saw Alexander Blackwood doing something he hadn't done in years. Working from somewhere other than his office or penthouse, he'd found a small cafe across from St. Bartholomew's Hospital, where he could observe the comings and goings while formulating his plan. His usual pristine suits had been replaced by more casual attire, still expensive, but less conspicuous. Through careful observation and discreet conversations with hospital staff, he'd learned James's routine. Every morning his old friend would arrive at the hospital around 7, having spent the night in whatever shelter or doorway he could find. He'd clean up in the hospital's public restroom, transform himself as best he could, and spend the day by Emma's bedside, leaving only to search for ways to fund her increasingly expensive treatments. "Mr. Blackwood," his assistant's voice came through his earpiece. "I've compiled the research you requested on experimental genetic treatments. There's a promising trial at Imperial College London, but they're not accepting new patients without significant financial backing." Alexander made notes in his leather-bound notebook. "What about the pharmaceutical company leading the trial? Who are the key players?" "That's the interesting part, sir. The lead researcher is Dr. Victoria Chen. She was James Harrison's research partner before he left the industry." This information caused Alexander to sit up straighter. He remembered Victoria. She and James had worked together at Cambridge, sharing the same passionate drive to make medical breakthroughs accessible to everyone. The coincidence seemed almost too perfect. Later that afternoon, Alexander sat in Dr. Chen's office at Imperial College, taking in the organized chaos of research papers and medical journals covering every surface. Victoria hadn't changed much, still the same intense focus in her eyes, though now framed by elegant silver-streaked hair. "Alexander Blackwood," she said, studying him carefully. "I remember you from Cambridge. You were always with James in the library, though your nose was buried in financial journals while we discussed molecular structures." "Yes, well, different paths." Alexander shifted in his chair. "Speaking of James, that's why I'm here." Victoria's expression changed subtly. "I heard about Emma's condition. I've been trying to find him, but he seems to have disappeared completely. The treatment we're developing, so it could help her." "What would it take to get her into the trial?" Alexander asked, pulling out his checkbook. Victoria held up her hand. "It's not just about money, Alexander. We need a researcher with specific expertise in genetic markers, someone who understands the theoretical framework behind the treatment. James, he was doing groundbreaking work in this exact area before he left." Alexander leaned forward. "What if you could get him back?" "Back? Last I heard he'd fallen off the grid completely. The James I knew wouldn't have abandoned his research unless something more important demanded his attention," Alexander finished. "His daughter's life." They spent the next hour discussing possibilities. Victoria explained the trial's parameters, the potential breakthroughs, and most importantly, the role someone with James's expertise could play. Alexander's mind raced with possibilities, not just for Emma's treatment, but for James's redemption. As he left Imperial College, Alexander's phone buzzed with a message from the private investigator he'd hired. They'd found James's old research papers, including unpublished work that might be relevant to the current trial. More importantly, they discovered that James had continued his research in whatever spare moments he could find, making notes on napkins and newspapers while watching over Emma. In his car, Alexander reviewed the hospital's security footage his team had legally obtained. It showed James late at night, sitting beside Emma's bed, scribbling in a worn notebook by the dim light of hospital monitors. Even at his lowest point, he hadn't given up on the work. He just lacked the resources to pursue it. Alexander directed his driver to the hospital's pharmaceutical department. He had an idea, but it would require careful orchestration. He couldn't simply offer James a job or hand him money. That would likely be rejected out of pride or suspicion. The approach needed to be more subtle, more respectful of the brilliant mind that circumstances had forced into survival mode. In the hospital's research library, Alexander set up what would appear to be a chance encounter. He arranged for some of James's old research papers to be left on a table near where his friend usually spent his afternoon breaks, along with current journals discussing similar genetic markers. It was a small step, but perhaps seeing his past work in the context of current research might spark something. As evening approached, Alexander watched from his now familiar spot in the cafe as James emerged from the hospital. His old friend paused, looking up at the cloudy sky with exhausted eyes. Tomorrow, Alexander decided, would be the day to make contact, not as a successful businessman or potential benefactor, but as an old friend who remembered long nights in the Cambridge library, dreaming of changing the world. He touched the worn edges of James's last email in his phone, feeling the weight of 7 years of silence. The plan was risky. It could backfire spectacularly if James felt manipulated or patronized. But watching his friend shuffle away into the gathering darkness, Alexander knew he had to try. Sometimes, he reflected, the hardest part of helping someone isn't finding the resources. It's finding a way to offer them that preserves dignity and hope. The hospital library held a particular kind of silence in the early afternoon, not the sterile quiet of medical wards, but the thoughtful hush of minds at work. Alexander had positioned himself at a corner table, deliberately absorbed in reviewing medical research papers he'd spent the previous evening studying to understand. His usual power suit had been replaced by a simple sweater and trousers, an attempt to bridge the vast gulf that circumstances had created between him and his old friend. As predicted, James entered the library during his daughter's afternoon treatment session. Alexander watched from his peripheral vision as his former classmate noticed the strategically placed research papers. James paused, his weathered hands hovering over the familiar titles of his own published works. Interesting choice of reading material. James's voice was quiet, but carried the same intellectual curiosity Alexander remembered from their university days. Then, recognition flickered across his face. "Alex?" Alexander looked up, carefully controlling his expression to show surprise rather than the carefully orchestrated plan this was. "James? James Harrison?" They stood there, two men separated by decades of divergent paths, the fluorescent library lights illuminating every stark difference between them. James's face showed a flicker of shame as he unconsciously touched his worn clothing, but Alexander quickly pressed forward with genuine warmth. "I've been reading about genetic markers in rare disorders." Alexander gestured to the papers. "Though I must admit most of it might as well be written in Sanskrit. You were always the one who understood this level of science." James's eyes darted toward the exit, his body language suggesting an internal struggle between flight and the pull of his life's work. "These conclusions," he said finally, pointing to one of the papers, "they're using an outdated methodology, the newer approach." He stopped abruptly, as if remembering his current circumstances. "Please," Alexander pulled out a chair, "explain it to me. Just like old times in the Cambridge library when you'd help me understand enough biochemistry to pass Professor Williams's class." Something in the shared memory seemed to ease the tension. James sat, though perched on the edge of the chair like someone used to needing a quick escape. "You're still in finance, I assume?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Yes, though lately I've been looking into biotech investments." Alexander paused, then decided to take a risk. "Actually, I could use your expertise. There's a trial at Imperial College that's showing promise, but I need someone who understands the science to explain if it's viable." James's hands trembled slightly as he reached for one of the papers. "Victoria Chen's work," he noted, recognizing his former research partner's name. "She's continued down the path we were exploring 7 years ago." "James," Alexander spoke softly, "I found your email, the one from 7 years ago. I'm sorry I never responded." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words. Through the library window they could see patients and visitors in the hospital garden going about their lives, unaware of the weight of this moment. "Emma," James finally said, his voice cracking slightly, "she has the same condition we were researching. The irony isn't lost on me. I spent years trying to develop treatments for rare genetic disorders, only to have my own daughter." He stopped, composing himself. I saw her yesterday, Alexander admitted. I've been coming to the hospital this past week, trying to find the right way to approach you. James stiffened. You followed me that day with the wallet. Yes. Alexander met his friend's gaze steadily. And I saw what you did with the money. James, you haven't just been surviving on the streets. You've been continuing your research, haven't you? I saw your notes. James's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with suspicion. Have you been investigating me? I've been trying to understand, Alexander corrected gently. The James Harrison I knew was brilliant, dedicated, passionate about making medical breakthroughs accessible to everyone. That man doesn't disappear just because circumstances change. Outside, the autumn sun broke through London's perpetual clouds, casting warm light through the library windows. James stood and walked to the window, his silhouette a stark reminder of everything he'd sacrificed. The treatment Emma needs, he said finally. It's experimental, expensive. The research I've been doing, he gestured to his worn notebook. It's theoretical at best, without lab access, without resources. Alexander joined him at the window. What if you had those resources? Not as charity, James, as an investment in your research, in your brilliance. Victoria Chen is leading a trial that could help Emma, and they need someone with your expertise. James turned, his face showing a complex mixture of hope and fear. Alex, I haven't worked in a proper lab in years. I've been sleeping in shelters, living on the streets. But you never stopped being a scientist, Alexander insisted. The notes you've been making, the theories you've been developing, they're valuable. You just need the right platform to pursue them. The hospital library had emptied as afternoon shifted into evening, leaving Alexander and James alone among the towers of medical journals and research papers. The familiar scent of old books and the soft hum of fluorescent lights created an atmosphere reminiscent of their university days, making it easier to bridge the chasm years had created between them. Show me what you've been working on, Alexander said gently, gesturing to James's worn notebook. Help me understand. James hesitated before opening the notebook, its pages crammed with calculations and diagrams written in various inks, some entries clearly made by candlelight or street lamp. It's messy, he apologized, but I've been tracking Emma's responses to different treatments, correlating them with genetic markers I'd identified in my earlier research. As James explained his theories, Alexander watched his old friend transform. The uncertainty and shame that had haunted his features began to fade, replaced by the passionate intelligence that had once made him the star of Cambridge's biochemistry department. His hands, no longer trembling, moved animatedly as he described complex molecular interactions and potential treatment pathways. This approach, James pointed to a particularly detailed diagram, could potentially reduce the immune response that's making current treatments less effective, but without access to proper testing facilities. Victoria's lab has the equipment you'd need, Alexander interjected carefully, and the trial they're running aligns perfectly with your theories. James's expression darkened slightly. Victoria, she must think I abandoned everything we worked for. Actually, Alexander pulled out his phone and showed James his recent email exchanges with Victoria. She's been trying to find you. When I mentioned your name yesterday, she spent an hour telling me about the breakthrough you were close to before you left. A nurse passed by the library door, reminding James of the time. I need to check on Emma, he said, gathering his notebook. Her evening treatment. Let me walk with you, Alexander suggested, collecting the research papers. As they moved through the hospital corridors, he noticed how James acknowledged every staff member they passed, small nods and quiet greetings that spoke of a man who, despite his circumstances, had maintained his fundamental dignity and kindness. Outside Emma's room they paused. Through the window they could see her reading, her face showing the same quiet determination her father possessed. She has your resilience, Alexander observed. She's everything, James replied simply. When she was diagnosed, I had to choose between continuing my research career and being there for every treatment, every hospital stay. There was no real choice to make. But what if you didn't have to choose? Alexander asked. What if there was a way to do both? James turned to face his old friend, really studying him for the first time. Why are you doing this, Alex? Is it guilt over not answering my email? Or is this some sort of charitable project to make up for Timothy? The mention of his brother made Alexander flinch, but he met James's gaze steadily. Perhaps it started that way, with guilt, with memories of Timothy. But seeing your research, understanding what you've been working on despite everything, this isn't charity, James. It's an investment in brilliant work that could help not just Emma, but countless others. He pulled out a business card and a key. I've arranged for a temporary flat near the hospital. No strings attached, just a place to sleep, shower, and work on your research properly. Take a few days to think about Victoria's trial. The card has my direct number. When you're ready to discuss the details, call me. James stared at the key, emotions warring across his face. Alex, Dad, Emma's voice called from inside the room. Both men turned to see her waving through the window, her face lighting up at the sight of her father. Go, Alexander said softly. Be with your daughter. The key and card will be here at the nurse's station when you want them. He placed them on the counter, nodding to the nurse who had been watching their interaction with quiet interest. As he walked away, Alexander heard the door to Emma's room open and close, followed by the sound of quiet laughter as father and daughter reunited for the evening. He paused at the end of the corridor, looking back to see James sitting beside Emma's bed, his notebook open between them as he explained something that made her eyes shine with interest. In his pocket, Alexander's phone buzzed with messages from his office. Board meetings to attend, decisions to make, empire to run. But for the first time in years, the weight of those responsibilities felt balanced by something else. The possibility of making a real difference, not through grand charitable gestures, but through helping one brilliant mind return to work that could change lives. Outside the hospital, London's evening traffic created a symphony of city sounds. Alexander loosened his tie, thinking about the small flat he'd arranged. Nothing luxurious, but clean and comfortable, with a desk positioned by a window overlooking a quiet garden. On that desk, he'd left something he hoped would speak louder than any words could. A new notebook, several recent medical journals, and a laptop loaded with current research databases. Tools for a scientist to begin again. The key felt impossibly heavy in James's pocket as he stood outside the address Alexander had provided. It was early morning, the kind of crisp autumn day that made London feel fresh and full of possibility. He'd spent the night in his usual doorway, despite having the means to do otherwise. Some habits, he was learning, were hard to break. Emma's voice echoed in his mind from their conversation the previous evening. Dad, you always taught me to be brave enough to accept help when it's offered. Even at 12, she possessed a wisdom that sometimes took his breath away. The flat was on the third floor of a modest but well-maintained Victorian building. Each step up the stairs felt like a decision, each landing a chance to turn back. But Emma's morning treatment wouldn't begin for several hours, and for the first time in years, he had somewhere else to be besides a hospital corridor or street corner. The lock turned smoothly, and James stepped into a space that seemed to bridge his past and present. The flat was small but thoughtfully furnished. No luxury, but clean lines and practical comfort. The desk by the window caught his attention immediately. The setup was exactly what a researcher would need. Laptop, journals, notebooks, even a small whiteboard mounted on the wall. He placed his worn notebook beside the new one Alexander had left, the contrast between them stark and telling. Opening the laptop, he found it already loaded with access to medical research databases he hadn't been able to use in years. His hands trembled slightly as he typed in his first search query, recent developments in genetic markers related to Emma's condition. Hours passed unnoticed as James immersed himself in catching up with 7 years of research developments. He filled several pages of the new notebook with observations and connections, his mind racing with possibilities. The sun had risen fully, casting warm light across his workspace, when his phone buzzed with a text from Alexander. Victoria Chen will be at St. Bart's at 11 a.m. to discuss the trial. No pressure, but if you're interested, she'll be in the research library. James looked at his reflection in the window, at the beard that had grown wild, the clothes that marked him as someone society had forgotten. In the bathroom, he found new toiletries and a razor. Another choice to make. An hour later, James stood outside the hospital research library, clean-shaven for the first time in months, wearing simple but dignified clothes he'd found in the flat's wardrobe. They fit well enough to suggest Alexander had done his homework about more than just James's research. Victoria Chen was exactly as he remembered her, brilliant, focused, and incapable of hiding her emotions. When she saw him, her eyes filled with tears, she quickly blinked away. "James Harrison," she said, her voice steady despite her obvious emotion. "You look like a scientist again." "Feel more like one too," he replied, patting the notebook under his arm. "I've been reviewing your recent work on immune response modification." Just like that, they fell into the familiar rhythm of scientific discussion. Victoria explained the current trial's parameters, while James shared his observations, from monitoring Emma's responses to various treatments. His years of detailed notes, though made under desperate circumstances, contained valuable data that made Victoria's eyes light up with recognition of potential breakthroughs. "We need you on this team, James," she said finally. "Not just as a parent with valuable observations, but as the researcher you've always been. The position comes with full benefits, including medical coverage for dependents." The implication was clear. This could be the solution to Emma's treatment costs. But more than that, it was a chance to return to the work he loved, to potentially help not just his daughter, but others facing similar battles. "I need to think about it," James said carefully. "Discuss it with Emma." Victoria nodded, understanding. "The position is yours when you're ready. And James, welcome back to the world of science." That afternoon, sitting beside Emma's hospital bed, James shared everything: the flat, the job offer, the possibility of change. She listened with the serious attention she gave to all important matters, her young face thoughtful. "What are you afraid of, Dad?" she asked finally, showing that uncanny ability to read him that she'd had since she was small. "Failing," he admitted. "Failing you. Failing at the research. Failing to live up to this second chance." Emma reached for his hand, her grip strong despite her condition. "You've never failed me, Dad. You gave up everything to be here with me. Maybe now it's time to pick some things back up." James looked at his daughter, seeing in her face the strength that had kept them both going through the darkest times. She was right, of course. The past 7 years had been about survival, about keeping her alive and safe. Perhaps now they could begin to think about living again. He pulled out his phone and typed a message to Alexander. "Thank you for the flat. Victoria shared the details about the research position. Can we meet tomorrow to discuss the practical aspects?" The response came quickly. "Name the time and place." "And James, Emma's treatment schedule is already factored into the lab hours. You won't have to choose between being a father and being a scientist." Looking out the hospital window at the London skyline, James felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not just hope, but a sense of possibility. He had spent so long focusing on surviving each day that he'd forgotten what it felt like to plan for a future. Now, watching Emma sketch out ideas in his new notebook, he allowed himself to imagine one. The Imperial College laboratory hummed with the familiar sounds of scientific equipment, centrifuges whirring, computers processing data, the gentle bubbling of water baths. For James, standing in his newly issued lab coat, it felt both foreign and deeply familiar, like returning to a childhood home after decades away. Victoria had arranged for his workspace to be near a window overlooking the courtyard, knowing his need to feel connected to the outside world after years on the streets. His old notebook sat open beside the latest research equipment, a bridge between his past and present. "These readings," Victoria said, leaning over his shoulder to examine Emma's treatment response data, "they're extraordinary. Even without proper lab equipment, you managed to document patterns we've only recently begun to understand." James adjusted the microscope, familiar movements returning to his muscle memory. "Necessity breeds innovation," he replied. "When traditional monitoring wasn't available, I had to find other ways to track the indicators." Their discussion was interrupted by a text message alert, Emma's daily update from the hospital. James had arranged with her medical team to receive regular reports during the hours he couldn't be physically present. Today's message brought good news. Her latest test results showed improvement. "Go," Victoria said, noticing his expression. "Take an early lunch. The lab will still be here when you get back." The walk to St. Bartholomew's took exactly 12 minutes. James had timed it carefully. In Emma's room, he found her sitting up in bed, working on her laptop. Alexander had arranged for her to continue her studies through an online program, ensuring she wouldn't fall behind, despite her hospital stays. "Dad?" Her face lit up as he entered. "How's the lab? Did you get to use the electron microscope yet?" James smiled, settling into his usual chair beside her bed. "Not yet. But I did start analyzing those protein markers we discussed yesterday. He pulled out his tablet, showing her the preliminary results. They had developed a habit of discussing his research together, Emma's quick mind grasping complex concepts with an ease that reminded him of himself at her age. "Look what Uncle Alex brought," Emma said, gesturing to a stack of advanced science textbooks beside her bed. She had started calling Alexander Uncle Alex naturally, the title emerging from their growing closeness over the past weeks. "He said these were the books that helped you get through university." James picked up one of the books, running his fingers over the familiar cover. "Your Uncle Alex is being modest. He was the one who helped me get through university. Did I ever tell you about the time he spent an entire night helping me prepare for a presentation, even though he had his own finance exam the next day?" "Tell me more about university," Emma requested, always eager for stories about her father's past. These conversations had become precious moments of normalcy in their hospital routine. As James shared memories of his student days, he noticed subtle changes in his daughter. Her color was better, her energy levels higher. The new treatment protocol, combined with the experimental medications from Victoria's trial, seemed to be having a positive effect. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Alexander stood there carrying 2 paper bags from the hospital cafe. "Thought you both might be hungry," he said, entering with the casual familiarity he'd developed over the past weeks. "Uncle Alex," Emma beamed. "Dad was just telling me about your university days." "Oh? Was he telling you about the time he nearly set the chemistry lab on fire, trying to impress Sarah Matthews?" James groaned good-naturedly. "I was hoping that particular story had been forgotten." The 3 of them shared lunch together, trading stories and laughing, a scene of normalcy that would have seemed impossible just weeks ago. James watched as Emma and Alexander discussed her online physics lesson, his friends showing the same patient explanation skills that had helped James through countless study sessions years ago. "I need to head back to the lab," James said eventually, gathering his things. The words still felt strange in his mouth, having somewhere to be besides the hospital or the streets. "Dad?" Emma called as he reached the door. "I'm proud of you." Those simple words caught him off guard, bringing a lump to his throat. He turned back to hug her, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling the strength in her embrace that matched the determination in her spirit. Walking back to the lab, James reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. The fear of failure still lingered, but it was gradually being replaced by something else, a cautious optimism that perhaps they could have more than just survival. They could have a future. In his pocket, his key ring held both his lab access card and the key to the flat, symbols of his gradual return to the world he'd left behind. But the most important things hadn't changed. His dedication to Emma, his passion for research, and now, the renewed understanding that accepting help didn't mean surrendering dignity. The late-night silence of the Imperial College laboratory was broken only by the soft clicking of computer keys and the occasional whir of equipment. James sat hunched over his workstation, surrounded by data readouts and test results. 3 months into his return to research, and he was finally beginning to see patterns emerging from the chaos. "James." Victoria's voice startled him. He hadn't realized she was still in the lab. "It's nearly midnight. Look at this," he said, gesturing to his screen without looking up. "The protein markers we've been tracking in Emma's blood work. They're showing a correlation I hadn't noticed before." Victoria moved closer, her eyes widening as she examined the data. "These readings, they're significantly different from our initial trial results." "What changed?" "I've been cross-referencing Emma's treatment responses with the molecular structures we identified in our research 7 years ago." James pulled up another screen of data. "Remember how we theorized about a cascading effect in the immune response? I think we're seeing it here, but not in the way we expected." The excitement in his voice was familiar to Victoria. It was the same tone he'd had during their university days when they were on the verge of something important. "Show me everything," she said, pulling up a chair. For the next 2 hours, they pored over the data together. James's detailed observations of Emma's responses, combined with the sophisticated analysis tools they now had access to, were revealing patterns that could have significant implications for the trial. "If we adjust the treatment protocol based on these findings," Victoria said, rapidly typing notes, "we might be able to improve the efficacy for all the trial participants." James sat back, running his hands through his hair. "We need to test the theory first. Set up a new series of trials with... His phone buzzed. A message from Alexander. Emma's asking for you. She had a rough evening but didn't want us to interrupt your work. I'm with her. Go, Victoria said, seeing his expression change. I'll start setting up the test protocols. We can review everything in the morning. The night air was crisp as James hurried through London's empty streets. In Emma's hospital room, he found her awake, Alexander dozing in the chair beside her bed. Dad, she smiled weakly. Did you figure it out? James sat on the edge of her bed, taking her hand. We might have. How are you feeling? Tired, but I want to hear about the research. Even pale and exhausted, her eyes showed the same intellectual curiosity that had always characterized their relationship. Alexander stirred, awakening. Sorry, I must have dozed off, he said, straightening in his chair. No, thank you for staying with her, James replied. Looking at his friend, disheveled in his expensive suit after spending hours in a hospital chair, James felt a wave of gratitude. Tell me about the breakthrough, Emma insisted, squeezing his hand. James began explaining the findings in terms she could understand, watching her face light up with interest, despite her fatigue. Alexander listened too, asking surprisingly insightful questions that showed how much he'd learned about the research over the past months. So, Emma said thoughtfully, if you're right about the protein markers, could it help other kids like me? That's what we're hoping, James replied. We need to run more tests, but the initial results are promising. Then you should get back to the lab, she said firmly. I'm feeling better now and Uncle Alex can stay a bit longer, right? Alexander nodded. Of course. Besides, your father needs someone to make sure he takes breaks and remembers to eat. James hesitated, torn between his daughter's immediate needs and the possibility of a breakthrough that could help her and others. Dad, Emma said softly, remember what you told me about science being a way to help people. This is your chance. I'm okay. I've got Uncle Alex and the nurses, and you're just a phone call away. Looking at his daughter, James saw not just her physical strength returning, but also her spirit growing stronger. The combination of the trial medications and their regular father-daughter research discussions seemed to be having a positive effect on both her health and her mind. Okay, he agreed, kissing her forehead. But promise you'll have them call me if you need anything. Promise, now go be brilliant. As James headed back to the lab, his phone buzzed with a message from Alexander. She's asleep already. I'll stay until morning. Focus on your work. We've got this. The message reminded him of their university days, of all the times Alexander had supported him through late-night study sessions and research projects. Now, years later, that support had evolved into something even more meaningful. Entering the lab, James found Victoria had already set up the preliminary tests they'd discussed. The equipment hummed with purpose, each machine working to validate or challenge their theories. On his desk, she'd left a fresh cup of coffee and a note. Like old times, changing the world one experiment at a time. James smiled, remembering similar notes they'd left for each other during their postgraduate research. Settling back into his work, he felt the familiar surge of scientific excitement, tempered now by years of personal experience and a father's desperate hope for a cure. The presentation room at Imperial College was filled to capacity. Research teams from across Europe had gathered to hear about the unexpected breakthrough in the genetic treatment trial. James stood at the podium, his newly pressed shirt and trimmed beard a far cry from his appearance just months ago. Victoria sat in the front row, nodding encouragingly, while Alexander watched from the back, pride evident in his expression. The key, James explained, gesturing to the complex molecular diagrams on the screen behind him, wasn't just in the protein markers themselves, but in the timing of their interaction with the immune system. By adjusting the treatment protocol based on individual patient responses, we've seen a significant increase in efficacy. The data spoke for itself, charts showing improved response rates, decreased side effects, and most importantly, sustained positive results in multiple patients. Emma's case study, presented anonymously, formed the cornerstone of their findings. Questions? James asked, concluding his presentation. Hands shot up across the room, leading to a vigorous discussion that confirmed what Victoria had been saying for weeks. They were onto something revolutionary. After the presentation, in the corridor outside, Victoria hugged him tightly. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant, she beamed. The research committee is already talking about fast-tracking the expanded trial. "None of this would have been possible without your faith in me," James replied, thinking of how she'd welcomed him back without hesitation, helping him bridge the gap between his theoretical work during his homeless years and current research methodologies. Alexander approached, having waited for the crowd of researchers to disperse. "I may not understand all the scientific details," he said, "but I understood those response rates. This is big, isn't it?" "Potentially life-changing," Victoria confirmed, "for Emma and for many others." James checked his phone. No messages from the hospital meant Emma was having a good day. She'd insisted on him giving the presentation, despite having a treatment scheduled, saying, "Dad, this is bigger than just us now." The three of them walked together to St. Bartholomew's, discussing the implications of the morning's presentation. In Emma's room, they found her propped up in bed, surrounded by books and her laptop looking stronger than she had in weeks. "How did it go?" she asked eagerly, closing her physics textbook. "Your father was magnificent," Victoria replied before James could speak. "The research committee is already talking about publication." Emma's face lit up. "Does this mean other kids will get to try the new treatment too?" "That's the plan," James said, sitting beside her. The expanded trial could start within months. Alexander watched from the doorway as father and daughter discussed the scientific implications, their shared enthusiasm for research creating a bubble of joy that seemed to fill the room. The scene was a far cry from the desperate chase through London streets that had started this journey. "Miss Harrison," a nurse appeared with a tablet displaying Emma's latest test results. "Your numbers are looking excellent today." James reviewed the results, his researcher's mind automatically correlating them with the trial data. The improvements were undeniable. Emma's body was responding to the modified treatment protocol even better than they'd hoped. "We should celebrate," Alexander suggested. "I know a certain young lady has been craving proper pizza from that place near the lab." "Uncle Alex, you promised not to tell." Emma laughed, the sound bright and clear in a way that made James's heart soar. "Well, as your doctor," Victoria added with mock seriousness, "I can confirm that pizza has significant therapeutic value in cases like this." As they shared dinner in Emma's hospital room, pizza from the best Italian restaurant in the area, courtesy of Alexander. James looked around at this unlikely family they'd formed. Victoria animatedly discussing future research possibilities with Emma, who followed every word with keen interest. Alexander attempting to understand their scientific terminology while somehow managing to keep everyone's spirits high with his gentle humor. "Dad," Emma said during a lull in conversation, "can I show them my project?" James nodded, knowing what she meant. Emma pulled out her notebook, she'd started keeping one just like his, and showed them the detailed observations she'd been making about her own treatment responses. "I've been tracking everything," she explained, "just like Dad taught me. I thought it might help with the research." Victoria examined the notebook with genuine interest. "Emma, this is excellent work. You've documented some correlations we hadn't even considered." "Like father, like daughter," Alexander smiled. "Should we expect another Dr. Harrison in the family?" The word family hung in the air, warm and true. They had become one, in their own unique way, bound together not by blood but by something equally strong. Shared purpose, mutual care, and unwavering support. Later that evening, as Emma slept peacefully, James stood by her window watching London's lights twinkle in the distance. Alexander joined him, both men comfortable in their silence. "Thank you," James said finally. "Not just for the opportunity, but for believing in me when I'd stopped believing in myself." "You did all the hard work," Alexander replied. "I just helped remove some obstacles." They watched as a shooting star streaked across the London sky, a rare sight in the city's light-polluted heavens. "Make a wish," James murmured, remembering how he and Emma used to do this during their nights on the streets. But looking at his daughter's peaceful face, the promising test results and the supporting presence of friends who had become family, James realized he didn't need to wish for anything. For the first time in years, he had everything he needed, and more importantly, he had hope for the future. Spring had arrived in London, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings. The hospital garden, visible from Emma's window, was bursting with fresh blooms, a fitting metaphor for the transformations taking place within the building's walls. Emma sat in a comfortable chair by the window, no longer confined to her bed, watching a group of medical students crossing the courtyard below. Her color had improved dramatically over the past weeks, and her energy levels were consistently higher. The modified treatment protocol had exceeded even their most optimistic expectations. "Ready for the big day?" James asked, entering the room with a garment bag draped over his arm. Inside was a new dress, Emma's choice for her discharge ceremony. "Almost," she replied, turning from the window with a smile that reminded James so much of her mother. "I just need to finish packing my research notes." The small table beside her bed was covered with notebooks, some filled with her observations about the treatment, others containing the physics and biology studies she'd maintained throughout her hospital stay. Alexander had recently commented that she was probably the only 12-year-old who could explain complex immune responses in detail. Victoria arrived as they were organizing the notes, carrying a thick manila envelope. "The latest trial results," she announced, her eyes bright with excitement. "The review board has officially approved the expanded program. We can start accepting new patients next month." Emma hugged her notebooks to her chest. "How many kids will get to try the treatment?" "Initially, 50, Victoria replied, sitting on the edge of the bed. "But if the results continue as they have been, it could become the standard protocol within a year." James watched his daughter's face light up at this news. Throughout her own treatment, she'd never lost sight of the bigger picture, how their research could help others facing similar battles. It was one of the many ways she amazed him daily. A knock at the door announced Alexander's arrival. He entered carrying a small gift bag and wearing the kind of smile that suggested he had news to share. "The board approved it," he said, hardly containing his excitement. "The Blackwood Foundation's first major initiative will be funding research fellowships for scientists working on rare genetic disorders. And," he added with a meaningful look at James, "we need a director for the research program." James felt his throat tighten with emotion. The foundation had been Alexander's latest project, a way to ensure that stories like James and Emma's would have happier endings in the future. The offer of the director position was more than just a job. It was a chance to continue making a difference on a larger scale. "Uncle Alex," Emma called from her chair, "can I show you my latest observations before the ceremony?" Alexander settled beside her, giving her his full attention as she explained her detailed notes. Over the months, he'd developed a genuine interest in the scientific aspects of their work, often serving as a bridge between the technical and human elements of the research. Victoria pulled James aside, showing him the details of the expanded trial protocol. "We've incorporated Emma's observation patterns into the monitoring guidelines," she explained. "Her insights about treatment timing have proven invaluable." The room gradually filled with hospital staff, nurses who had become like family, doctors who had supported their research, even the cafeteria worker who had always saved an extra pudding for Emma during her long stays. Each person had played a part in their journey, and each had come to celebrate this milestone. Dr. Chen, the head of pediatrics, arrived with Emma's final paperwork. "All set for discharge," he announced, "though I have a feeling we'll still be seeing plenty of you, young lady, given your budding interest in medical research." Emma grinned, already changed into her new dress. "Dad says I can help with the trial documentation over summer break," she said proudly. As James signed the discharge papers, he remembered the night he'd first brought Emma to this hospital, desperate and homeless, willing to do anything to save his daughter. The contrast between then and now was stark, not just in their circumstances, but in the web of support and purpose they'd found along the way. Alexander approached with a small wrapped package. "A going-home gift," he explained, handing it to Emma. Inside was a professional-grade research notebook, embossed with her name, Emma Harrison, Research Associate. "Really?" she gasped, looking between Alexander and her father. James nodded. "Victoria and I thought you might like to continue helping with the trial documentation, officially this time." The ceremony was simple but meaningful. Emma's primary nurse gave a touching speech about courage and determination. Victoria presented a summary of how Emma's case had advanced their understanding of genetic treatments. Alexander spoke about the power of second chances and the importance of community. As Emma prepared to walk out of the hospital room that had been her home for so long, she paused, taking one last look around. "You know what, Dad?" she said thoughtfully. "I think sometimes the best discoveries happen when we're not looking for them." James hugged his daughter close, understanding she meant more than just scientific discoveries. Sometimes the best findings were the ones that couldn't be measured in a lab, like friendship, family, and the kind of love that transforms lives. Together, they stepped into the spring sunshine, ready to begin the next chapter of their story. Behind them, the hospital stood as a testament to their journey, not just of healing, but of rediscovery, purpose, and the profound power of human connection. 1 year later, the auditorium at Imperial College was filled to capacity, but this time it wasn't James standing at the podium. It was Emma. At 13, she commanded the attention of the entire room as she presented the patient perspective at the International Conference on Genetic Research. "When my father first started documenting his observations about my treatment," she began, her voice clear and confident, "we were living on the streets. He used discarded newspapers to write his notes, and he never stopped believing that science could make a difference. Today, 1 year after the trial that saved my life, 250 other patients are receiving this treatment worldwide." In the front row, James sat between Alexander and Victoria, watching his daughter with profound pride. She had grown stronger with each passing month, her medical progress matched by her flourishing intellect and determination to help others. The Blackwood Foundation's research center occupied the top floor of a renovated Victorian building near the hospital. Through its windows, James could see the spot where he'd once spent nights huddled in doorways. Now it housed state-of-the-art laboratories where scientists from around the world collaborated on treatments for rare genetic disorders. After Emma's presentation, the conference hall buzzed with energy. Young researchers gathered around her, asking questions about her experience and her own budding research interests. She handled their attention with grace, already showing signs of the scientist she was becoming. "Like father, like daughter," Victoria commented, watching the scene. "She has your gift for making complex ideas accessible." As head of research at the Foundation, Victoria had overseen the expansion of their treatment protocol into an international program. Alexander, who had remained a constant presence in their lives, smiled thoughtfully. "Remember the wallet?" he asked James quietly. "I never told you, but after that first night, I followed you to several shelters, trying to figure out how to help without compromising your dignity." "I know," James replied, surprising his friend. "I saw you a few times. I was just too proud to accept help then." He paused, watching Emma engage with a group of medical students. Sometimes the hardest part of helping someone is finding a way to let them help themselves. The Foundation's latest initiative, spearheaded by Emma's suggestions, focused on creating support systems for families facing similar challenges. It wasn't just about medical treatment anymore. It was about providing comprehensive care that addressed both the scientific and human aspects of recovery. Later that evening, they gathered in the small garden behind James and Emma's new home. Not a luxurious space, but one filled with life and purpose. Victoria had brought her famous lasagna. Alexander had supplied the finest non-alcoholic sparkling cider, and Emma had insisted on baking a cake to celebrate the conference's success. "I have an announcement," Emma said, as they enjoyed their dinner under the early evening sky. "I've been accepted into the Young Scientist program at Imperial College. They're letting me attend advanced classes while finishing my regular schooling." The news was met with delighted but unsurprised congratulations. Emma's academic achievements had accelerated along with her recovery, her mind seeming to flourish as her body healed. "We should show them, Dad," she added, glancing at James for permission. He nodded, knowing what she meant. Emma disappeared inside and returned with a well-worn notebook, James's original research journal from their days on the street. She'd had it carefully preserved, and now it sat in a place of honor in their home, a testament to perseverance and hope. "This is where it all started," she explained, carefully opening the pages filled with her father's meticulous observations. "Dad always says that science is about asking questions, but I think it's also about believing in answers, even when they seem impossible." Alexander raised his glass. "To impossible answers," he toasted, "and to the people brave enough to seek them." As the evening wore on, James watched the easy interaction between these people who had become his family. Victoria and Emma were deep in discussion about her upcoming academic program, while Alexander shared stories about their university days, now viewed through the lens of wisdom and experience. The garden lights cast a warm glow over the scene, so different from the harsh streetlights that had once been their only illumination. Yet James knew that every step of their journey, even the darkest ones, had led them here to this moment of purpose and possibility. Emma's voice broke through his reflection. "Dad, Show them the new research proposal. James pulled out a folder containing the Foundation's latest initiative, a program to identify and support brilliant minds who might otherwise be lost to circumstance. It was personal for him, a way to ensure that other potential researchers wouldn't have to choose between their work and their families. It's more than just funding, he explained. It's about creating a community that understands both the scientific and human elements of research. As the night drew to a close, Emma fell asleep in her favorite garden chair, her conference presentation notes still clutched in her hand. Looking at her peaceful face, James remembered all the nights he'd watched her sleep in hospital rooms and shelters, praying for a miracle. But the real miracle, he now understood, hadn't been just in the scientific breakthrough. It had been in the confluence of friendship, determination, and the kind of love that transforms lives. Alexander's simple act of dropping a wallet had set in motion a chain of events that reminded them all of humanity's capacity for compassion and innovation. "We did good, didn't we?" Alexander asked softly, helping James cover Emma with a blanket. "We did," James agreed, looking at the stars visible above their small London garden. "But more importantly, we're still doing it." Victoria joined them, carrying Emma's preserved notebook. "This belongs in the Foundation's library," she said. "Future generations should know that sometimes the most important research doesn't start in a lab. It starts with love, determination, and the refusal to give up hope." As the London night settled around them, the small garden held more than just 4 people. It held the promise of countless lives that would be touched by their work, a legacy of hope that would continue long into the future.